everybody. Just welcome. This is the 5th Annual Parent Network Workshop Conference, and we are pleased that you are going to join us for Our Mess Isn't Just the Dishes, Understanding Secondary Trauma in the Home. Before we get started, we just have a couple housekeeping items. First, if you have questions during the session, there is a Q&A feature as part of Zoom, so just pop that question in there and we will get to that. We do have some polls that may pop up during the session. They're anonymous, so feel free to contribute. After the session, you are going to see a survey about the session you just attended. We'd really appreciate it if you took a moment to fill that out. If you are an Idaho parent, we have our new Parent Network survey that went live today, and we'd love to hear your voice about how how you are impacted by Idaho's mental health system for children. You'll get a link in the email that is coming out tomorrow, but you can also go to idahoparentnetwork.org and go ahead and take that survey now. Also, in the coming days, we will be posting the recordings of this session, along with slides and links and other helpful resources. So go ahead and once again, check back with idahoparentnetwork.org in a couple days and share what you find if anyone you know that you can be helpful to. So with that out of the way, we want to introduce our presenters today. We have Michelle Batten, who is with the Idaho Federation of Families and is our expert today on trauma. We're really excited to listen to her and all the things she can teach us. And Amy and I are parents, and I'll start by telling a little bit about myself and then let Amy kind of talk a little bit about herself and her family. I am a parent with a special needs kiddo who has some mental health concerns. He has a dual diagnosis, which means we have more than just mental health, but through our experiences and through the stuff that we have worked on, we have some trauma, both that happened to him and then how that trauma actually impacted our family. So I'm very excited about today's session. Amy?
I'm Amy, and I'm a parent of 8 children. We adopted 5 children through the Idaho foster system. So our family has a lot of childhood trauma and a variety of it. And not only that, we have children with a lot of mental health concerns and diagnoses. And we also have 2 kiddos with autism and some other developmental delays and concerns. So we deal with a lot, and we all have trauma from the experiences that we've had with our children. And it's affected their siblings as well. So kind of a domino effect in our house. But I'm excited to be with you today and share what we've learned.
Okay, are we ready, Laura, to jump in?
We are. We just started our first poll talking about who we've got in our session today.
Okay. So our first poll is right up there, getting to know you. Do you have a child in your home with trauma? And what the second part of that is what types of trauma?
And then getting to find out who's with us today, what lens that we share are with parents, providers, advocates, etc. Just so we know who we're talking with.
Super. So let's look at what's trauma. Laura, do you want to share that piece of who is it we have here today?
So far, well, we've got about half of the people responding so far. Oh, it's coming in fast. It's kind of fun to watch these numbers. Right now, we have about 60% of us have children with trauma in our homes. Some people aren't quite sure, but it's about 60%. And it looks like domestic violence is one of our big ones. We do have, well, actually, we've got a lot of trauma. A lot of us are talking about child abuse and neglect, domestic violence. Those are probably our biggest. Secondary trauma is actually quite up at the list as well. And about 40% are parents. And then we're evenly split with advocates and providers and other types of visitors.
Super. All right, so let's just start with the lens of what is trauma. And I'll start with where I normally typically teach with parents in talking about trauma when they're looking at their own children. I talk about abuse and neglect as probably the trauma society recognizes immediately, right? That those are things that we would put in that category. But difficult pregnancy, difficult birth, multiple medical experiences, and disasters are also counted in those categories of trauma. If you look at that list when you're talking about your kids and thinking through trauma, it's interesting to consider that difficult pregnancy, difficult birth, and multiple medical experiences are often or sometimes out of the control of the parent. For example, many of the stresses during my first pregnancy were positive stresses, but they were putting a lot of cortisol on that baby's little brain, and that meant he came with a brain that was wired differently. And so trauma can be inflicted on someone, but it also, there's this piece that not all parents can control all pieces of what trauma is. And for that matter, multiple medical experiences and disasters aren't something we get to control for our children either. So part of our goal today, I skipped that piece of the slide. I'm going to go back. I'm not going to go back. But part of our goal today is to take that guilt off of parents and recognize that trauma isn't ours to put on our shoulders. And this is these experiences are what put our children into this place of they've experienced trauma.
I think it's important to point out that abuse doesn't always happen at home. And so, and not always at our home. And so it's possible to have a child who's experienced abuse that you weren't even there for. And I know that there's the stigma, oh, your child was abused, you know, and you're like, whoa, yes. I wasn't there. I'm doing everything I can to help, but it wasn't me. And that's a struggle, I think, for a lot of families, that assumption gets made.
Yes. Thanks for putting that out, Laura, because in my head, as I help families, most often the families I help, that isn't the case, that the abuse was in their own home. So that didn't even come to my mind as I read those labels, right? So good point. So what we're here today, though, is to talk about this idea of compassion fatigue, and what is it, and this idea of secondary trauma. And I think it's important to talk about why parents and caregivers are at risk for this idea of secondary trauma. And one of those things is that you have empathy. And we have empathy for our children, and we have empathy for both the child in our home with a mental illness, but also those living in our home who are navigating that. And so as parents, we have a risk of internalizing those extreme behaviors and extreme occurrences in our home, those things that put trauma on other people and our own child's trauma. There's also lack of recovery time. As you know, it can be constant, and the roller coaster ride can be constant. Another piece is unresolved personal trauma. Any parent knows that children have the ability to surface our own stories and how those impact our parenting. And also for many parents, they come to this place of feeling powerless. And so that can bring this secondary trauma, this compassion fatigue, to rise to the surface. Any thoughts, Amy or Laura? I just
think that I had a therapist one time ask me, so how much time does your child live at home? And I remember just kind of tipping my head a little bit and going, what? And, you know, like, that's an option. There's a timeshare option here. I mean, what? And she went on to talk about how most people, I think she gave the statistic 80% at the time. I don't know if it's still an accurate percentage, but she said that 80% of marriages for kids who have serious developmental or emotional delays end in divorce. And so she made the assumption that my husband and I were no longer married, and that my child was spending time with my ex. Well, I didn't have an ex. I had a current and an only. And I just remember for the first time thinking, you mean some people share this like in another place? They go away? That sounds fabulous. I mean, no, he's here all the time. But that was the first time it had ever occurred to me that, yeah.
Yeah, I had a therapist tell me one time a few years ago that she said the same statistics. Most families end in divorce, and she said it was a miracle that I hadn't run away yet, because not only was it one child that she knew of, it was our whole family. And not having a therapist until recent years even acknowledge the fact that our family does have that secondary trauma or PTSD from the behaviors of our children, really made me look at it differently and how it has affected all of us. And it gave me the permission, or I gave myself the permission, to do a lot more self-care and set some more boundaries for myself and expectations, lowering my expectations of how much I could do, and taking in consideration that what I do for one child does affect the other children, and how many appointments I have. When I have 30 appointments a week, there's some resentment, and our children's treatment plans can negatively affect the other children in the home, unintentionally. So I think it's important for providers to speak with families about it, and for parents to speak up and be vulnerable and let them know where you're at, and let other parents know they're not alone.
Good. All right. So we'll have a poll in a minute, but let's go through some of these symptoms of what secondary trauma looks like. Because you're right, it's real, it's there. And as we go through these, I recognize that we're talking about a subject that can bring out big feelings, that can cause its own trigger response, right? As we're digging into what's going on and thinking about your own home. Our goal, again, is to release that guilt, to recognize that this is actually a piece of the journey and there's resources for you. So I'm going to frame what we're talking about in that, because I want to make sure that if you are beginning to feel that out of control feeling, or that concerns of your own trauma response, that you might reach out for help from one of us, or support rather from one of us, and that either we can point you in the right direction or provide that support you might need as a parent. So let's look at some of the symptoms. So behavioral, I think we think of that idea of PTSD, or as we've thrown around words, we've used PTSD, compassion fatigue. We used another one too, right?
Secondary trauma.
Thank you. I was like, there was a third one I heard. It's almost the scale, right, of how tough things are, and where we're thrown into that category, and what we don't always get to control where we are in that range, but that whole range shares these symptoms, right? The intensity may vary, but it shares these symptoms. That there's behavioral outbursts and perfectionism. And so one more thing is that I'd like to talk about just staying present with yourself, not analyzing the 6 other kids or the 1 other kid, right? That and as we're talking about your children or child with mental health, that right now you just think about yourself, and is this you, and do you need help? So those outbursts or perfectionism, those are behavioral pieces we might see with someone who's fatigued. Emotions of sadness, anger, prolonged grief, anxiety, mood swings, when you have less joy, there's that hopelessness and numbness that might come along with secondary trauma that we might see. Somatic, which is a fancy way of saying body responses, right? I call the somatic the bear in the room response, like you're living with this bear in the room, because when we see a bear in the forest, we might have responses we can't control in our body. And sometimes we have to live with that feeling that there's a bear in the room and our body responding constantly. So those might be headaches or stomach aches. Are you holding it in your back? Are you exhausted? Are you replaying those experiences in your body of standing in the kitchen when something was thrown at you? Is that going over and over in your head, and your body is tensing up each time it gets to that certain scene? Are you seeing decrease in sleep? That's another thing that is common. Spiritual aspect also is impacted. You might be isolating, you may be questioning your worldview. And I'm not sure everyone would put this in this category, but I believe it's spiritual, is that shame, this trigger of shame and value and worth. And so I think that's an important piece to start examining the lies that what's replaying in your head. What is the story being told in your head? And in regard to shame, the lies that are being told. And then lastly, this piece of cognitive, that fuzzy feeling, that buzz in your head, lack of concentration or difficulty with decisions.
Yeah,
all right, Lori,
you
can put up the poll as you're
okay.
done, and I'm going to look at the Q&A questions. Go ahead.
Okay, so I was going to say that when it comes down to cognitive, the joke I have is that I have 2 brain cells left, and that I've duct taped them together for safety. Because one of them is trying to wiggle out and take off. And there are some days that I am grateful that I remember my name. And there's other days I can remember the birthdays of my childhood friends and that I haven't seen in 20 years. And I can't tell you what day it's going to be tomorrow. I may not even be able to tell you what day it's going to be this afternoon. So, but the guilt, the should I, could I, would I, it's really hard to walk around with all of this. And when you said behavioral, I laughed. I'm like, so is that what we call my candy addiction? I don't do caffeine, which is good, or I'd be the Energizer Bunny. But, I may or may not have a candy stash that my kids will get their hands smacked if they try and steal from me. And that is one of my coping strategies. Is it great? No. Is it better than some of them? Yeah. So
I think it's also important to recognize that they wax and wane. I mean,
that's what I was going to say.
I've experienced all of these, and sometimes it's a lot more frequent than others. It is really dependent on the current crisis in our home going on and the support that I feel. But definitely I've experienced all of them. And so just because you don't have it all the time doesn't mean, I think sometimes, at least for me, I was in denial a long time of my own mental health and how much of a toll my children's mental health and everything that we were dealing with was affecting me personally. And I was afraid to have my own diagnosis, which I don't understand why that now, but.
Because who has the space to handle another? Right. I mean, doesn't it feel like that? If we name it, then it's there, and then we have to handle it. And I'm already handling 30 appointments a week. How can I handle?
Exactly. And I know for children, the last session they were talking about this, but every time my child would get a new diagnosis and a new provider would trigger this for me, that the anxiety and how am I going to put one more appointment in my schedule, and how do I not do that though? And, and people make comments about, can't you cut back on some appointments? I'm like, yeah, sure. You let me know which child's most important in my life, and let me know which diagnosis I should be avoiding right now. And so just realize with yourself that these do they can come and go. It doesn't mean that you're always in a constant state of,
Yes,
you know, feeling this.
Well, I think for me, I'm going to give it air quotes, opportunity to have everyone home for the last however many months. It has made some things a lot easier. I mean, like Amy said, I haven't been running around to any appointments for the last 6 months. That's been great. But at the same time, there's a lot of stuff that is more obvious because we're sitting with it. And, there isn't the ability to escape. Respite options are less. When respite becomes which room of the house can you hide in before they find you, then they'll look there next time. So it's a one-time deal. I think that we have to give ourselves a lot of grace that we didn't recognize we needed to give before, because our normal coping strategies for all of these things kind of got shook up when the pandemic started. And depending on where you live and how many people are in your house is how much you have been able to separate from the constant nearness of what's going on around you. So
that was definitely the most difficult part. Part of our children, we have safety plans in place for them, and our kiddos that were stable and had been stable for some time really took a hit, and we weren't able to use the safety plan in place because our biggest thing that we use is separation, and we use respite care, and we have children go to different homes and have breaks from one another. And one of the questions that we got in the chat are talking about parents who have this fatigue and they don't have anywhere to turn to, and they don't have agencies in their area that provide respite. So
across the state, that is true, right? We're having trouble with that. So
I would definitely suggest reaching out to Children's Mental Health, Idaho Federation of Families, and see if there are individual respite workers or people that you are able to get a voucher for and pay for yourself. Now, and I understand that seems almost impossible. I remember when we moved here 4 years ago, I had no one. I had absolutely no one to turn to. And for the first time in my life, I had to find new natural supports, and that was extremely difficult. And I turned to the Federation, and I turned to IPOL, and I ended up finding other special needs parents through a Facebook group. So I understand that that's very real, not be able to have like a center for respite.
So when we moved here, we don't have any family in Idaho. And when we moved here, we didn't know anyone. So how I started respite was I actually put an ad out for a special needs caregiver. I happen to use care.com, and they have babysitters and nannies options, but they actually do have a section to be specific to special needs kiddos. And so I put in what I wanted. I kind of felt like I was putting in my Mary Poppins list, rosy cheeks, plays games, all sorts. I mean, isn't that what's on the Mary Poppins wish list? But I did, and I ended up with a lot of answers. Now, I paid for that, but it was the only way I was going to find respite. And I found a group of people, and they knew I rotated between them so that no one got too overwhelmed. And that's how I found my respite providers. So, I happen to live near a university, so it's a target-rich environment, but there are people who aren't college students who do it all the time as well. So that's how I found someone outside of an agency. That wasn't going to work for our family, so that's how I did it.
And the thing is if we just sit here on these hard symptoms, then we're stuck, right? Like it does feel stuck. And how do you put things around you? And so that's one piece I want to talk about, because if we just throw the tools at our families, or if the families just are grasping for tools, I think of it like a hole, and we're throwing tools down in this hole, but they have a ladder for things they've already succeeded with in life already. and we need to help them discover that ladder. So I think of that way when we talk about the 5 protective factors and what are important aspects for families to consider, and where can they already build that they already are strong. So the 5 protective factors that these are the protective factors that research has shown mitigate high ACE scores. ACE is the adverse childhood experience. It's a measure that over the years we talk about adverse childhood experiences impacting long-term health and being a measure of trauma. And so these 5 protective factors actually are shown to mitigate the impact of trauma. So having these in your family, beginning to build these, and I would say today, looking at these and saying, what is my strength, is important. And we'll do a poll in a minute about that after we discuss these. So number 1 we have here is social connection. Looking at healthy social connections with friends and families, professionals and colleagues, and that you might be able to look at the place where you have connections. Now, we all know that this has been stirred up in the last however months we're living through this, 8, 9, I keep saying 6, but it's got to be way past that now, that our social connections have been minimized, right? But I think, Laura, what you said is having that group who you rotated through, who you knew you could trust, that's really important, right? What are those connections, those places? I almost think of it as putting my name in the middle and then just all the people. This isn't just the people I see always, because honestly right now that's precious few here at my desk, but these are the people who I have a thread of connection to, and how might those people weave into my own story. Number 2, any comment, ladies, on that one, Amy or Laura?
I would say that especially during this time, using technology to reach out to people. I have some friends that really like using Marco Polo or Duo, or where it's a video chat so we can see each other and it's not just talking and it's not just texting. And so I oblige and I get on video even when I don't want to, but it helps to have that connection.
It does, doesn't it?
I have a bit
and
of
also monitoring it too, because I also noticed my increase in social media time went up significantly, because I was grasping at straws to feel connected and to share this experience with everyone, and got to the point where I realized I needed a social media fast, or needed to put a time limit on how often I was checking in, because I recognize that when we are on social media, as positive as it can be, it can also be really draining. And I noticed about myself that I am, being an empath, I'm very emotional and I can feel other people's emotions. So even if I'm not worried and frenzied, being around or surrounding myself with people who are affect me. And so, those healthy social connections is really important. Knowing what your boundaries are, how much time you can spend with certain people is important.
So my funny story is that I don't know, in my life, maybe everyone else is better than this, but in my life, it all hits at the same time. It's like all of the nastiness coordinates and it all hits the fan within a short period of time. So when I'm staggering from one, I get hit by another, and then I stagger back and get hit by something else. And I had a day that, and this will make Amy laugh because she knows about it, but I had a day where I couldn't do anymore. I had hit my limit. It wasn't going to happen. I was done, but I wasn't done. I mean, there was so much more I had to do, and I couldn't melt down, because I knew if I did, I wasn't going to get back up. And there was so much that had to happen. And so I actually called a friend, and she's probably listening right now and laughing pretty hard, but I called a friend and I asked her to have a meltdown. I said, I need you to kick something. I need you to scream. You can throw some things, break whatever's not valuable. I'll replace it when you're done. You can cuss as much as you want. You can go in the backyard and yell and scream and jump up and down. And when you're done, message me or call me and let me know how good it felt. Because I need a meltdown, but I can't have it right now. And she kind of paused and said, are you outsourcing your meltdown? And I said, yes, I am. And she's like, oh, I'm on it. And I heard later that it was an epic meltdown. I did a great job. I really did. And, you know, for me, knowing that somebody else was yelling and screaming because I couldn't right now, it actually felt really, really good. And there have been many times that I have called frustrated and she has said, do I get to have another meltdown for you? That was so much fun. And I needed that.
And it's important so not recognizing that not all parents have these social connections, right? And that they've been jeopardized in this time. I think it's good to think, when is another time where that worked for me, right? Amy, you were able to say, this isn't filling my bucket, and these might not be true connection, they might be false connection on social media, or it's draining, whichever that was. But when is another time where how have I met that need for social connection, and how can I build on that? Because I've done it before someplace, right? Because, and if not, maybe we'll skip this and move to the next, because maybe that's not the strength, and maybe that's an area where a protective factor someday, this isn't the place to talk about it, but someday you'll be able to build on that. And so concrete support in the time of need is identifying, assessing, and participating in services. Most of the parents in this group, at least the two on the screen, I don't know everyone else behind the screens, are really good at this, right? At accessing those concrete supports. Where does my kid get this? But are you good at it for yourself? So this isn't just about your kiddo. Are you building this for yourself? Are you able to find the need, name it, and find a way to meet that need? Not just for other people, but, and the reason I know you can is because you've done it for your own kids most of the time. Third is social and emotional competence. So I'm going to move my screen over so I see my second screen well, because I don't want to misspeak. So that is forming secure peer and adult relationships. Now, this is always my, I am pretty passionate about attachment and understanding attachment. And many people who, at least in many people who go into the helping professions are lower than the general public, who have about 50% of the general public have the ability to create secure attachments. In the helping profession, that's less, and in the foster parent and adoptive community, that's also less. And this social and emotional competence may be filed way in the back of our brains when we're caring for a kiddo with extreme behaviors. But being able to navigate relationships and boundaries and regulation of our own emotion and expressing that emotion is a piece of that. Again, I think of that roller coaster, right? Like, I'm not talking like the high of like blowing it or the low of the day you can't get out of bed, but are you able to regulate generally emotions?
I think one of my biggest problems with secondary trauma in the home is that I recognize it in myself, but then we have siblings. And, you know, so we have a kid who has some pretty hard stuff going on, and it oozes all over everything. And, you know, as an adult and as a parent, I can say, you know what, I'm the parent and I'm going to suck it up and I'm going to handle it. But what when, you know, when it's the siblings who it's not their responsibility, it's not their thing, it's not their stuff, but it's still something that's in their lives. I'm looking at this list and thinking, you know, our kids have to be taught how to do this for their own protection, for their own well-being, and for their own happiness. Because as much as it hurts to see my, you know, one child really struggling, it hurts equally, if not more so, to watch another child struggle because of something completely out of their control in our home. And it's not that we're not trying or we're not helping or we're not working towards it. It's that it is so tangible in our home.
Of course.
And it does, it doesn't, I don't set a place for it at the table, but it seems like it's always there.
Mm-hmm.
And
Mm-hmm.
I have skills as a parent that my other kids don't. So how do I make this help them too?
Right. And so let's go around the full circle and then come back to this one, because I think the social emotional competence gets messy, right? Like, we can teach our kids how to access support. That's a tangible thing that we can say, oh, slowly teach them to call and make their own appointment by the time they leave our home, or whatever those markers are to access. The social and emotional competence is both taught and caught, right? We both teach it by showing, I can't talk about this right now, it's too much, and regulating our own emotions, coming back, rupture and repair, those types of things in relationships. And so it's taught more passively than let's dial the phone, right? Let's call your caregiver and I'll tell you what to say while you're on the phone, which is more concrete support kind of thing. So I think that's important to recognize that caught piece of the social and emotional competence. And one of the reasons I think it's important to start with what are my own strengths, because guess what? I'm actually teaching that strength. I am building these things in my family, and I am building these things for my kids. And I might be weak in the area of the ability to build peer relationships. That might not be the place where I'm strong. But we don't have to be strong in all of these to build a foundation for healing for our kids. Knowledge of parenting and child development. This gets flipped on its head, doesn't it, when we have a kid with mental health needs. I remember talking to a parent to a teacher in a gifted education program, and she was talking about incongruent development, about, they might be really high in their IQ, but way down here in emotional. We don't think of typical kids being that way, and we don't always get that information for parenting kids with mental health needs, but that's what they are, incongruent in their physical, emotional, all the different areas of development. So understanding parenting a child that's in this area of children's mental health and understanding what child development should look like is really important. And last, that piece of parent resilience. When else have you gotten through a hard thing? When else have you had a traumatic experience that you made it through? What other challenges have you faced? So Laura, I would like to hear your thoughts while you're putting up that poll. Not just Laura, Amy and Laura, I'd like to hear your thoughts while you're that poll. Sorry, Amy. I'm just trying to organize it all in my head.
So the poll's up, but I have to say that when I hit a wall, when I just can't go any farther, I realize that I haven't implemented these things. I think as parents, we find the biggest fire on our head first, and we handle that fire, and then we go to the next fire, and then, oh, that's one started back up. Let's go handle that one again. Oh, well, that one needs some attention. Oh, no fires. I'm going to take a nap. Oh, waking up from a nap to handle a fire. And so when we're scrambling, these are the things we tend to drop first. Mm-hmm. I can take care of myself later. I'll remember to do that. I need to take care of somebody else now. And long-term, that's not a great idea. And I find that when I forget to do these things, I find myself withdrawing. I find myself, actually for me, it's when I'm cognitively impaired, when I realize I can't hold a thought. That's actually usually when I call Amy and I will go through everything I think I'm thinking and have her sort it back out for me and give it back to me. And then I can go forward, because I've done two things. One is, well, I've outsourced my brain cells, but I've also made sure I had that social connection, and that I reached out for support when I needed it. And somehow just having somebody else know that it's a thing. I mean, Amy can't fix it for me most of the time. Sometimes she can, and she's amazing, but you know, some of the things just aren't fixable by anyone. They're get throughable, but not necessarily fixable. And having someone else be aware of me and where I am makes all the difference.
I think having someone that knows what it's like. I mean, my connections now pale in comparison to what they were before. I mean, where I used to live, I'd lived there most of my adult life. I had a lot of friends. I had a lot of family. I could, you know, they would take turns giving us breaks with the children. And so our situation was different. I mean, we had a lot of crises back then, but they were really compassionate. But what I didn't have were other special needs parents that were used to the types of crises that we had. And being here and reaching out to those families, I mean, I think, you know, I was thinking about the social, emotional, and reaching out. For a long time after I moved here, I dreaded, and I am a super social person. So I know for me, one of my flags are when I start to withdraw or I do not want to be out in public, I know that is a sign for me. And I would get worried about people even asking me, oh, how are things doing? How are you doing? You know, because on one hand, I want to just say fine. And on the other hand, I didn't want to lie and I wanted to tell them, but you have to pick and choose wisely who you share with and whether or not they can understand. And by sharing with them, is it going to cause more grief and harm to your family? Or are you going to get the support that you need? And so I had to learn to, you know, nod my head or come up with something, you know, I've had better days, or I'm still alive, you know, so I felt like I was acknowledging what I was going through without having to actually tell the majority of people. And then the other thing that came to my mind when we were talking about this, when I think about my children, I think it's important, and I've had workers remind me this, it's important to give my children an opportunity to vent in a safe place with me when they're venting about their other siblings, you know, about it not being fair, you know, whatever it is that they are talking about, whether it be the appointments or the behaviors or the police involvement or, you know, whatever involvement we get because of another child's choices affects everyone in the household. And I need to be able to sit with them and let them talk about how that makes them feel and not tell them, you know, oh, it's going to be okay, or try to make everything rosy and positive. Take it at face value. And I think that allows our children to understand that it does affect them. And a lot of times they don't want to admit that it affects them, or they don't want to get help because, well, that's for that kid in the house. I'm not like that kid. Even though the majority of my children, I mean, we have, you know, overlapping diagnoses, and a lot of them have a lot of behaviors in common, but they don't want that commonality. They don't want to be seen as that child or that sibling. Right. So recognizing that as a parent is really important.
We just had a comment pop up that I think is an important one. We actually had a couple pop up that I think are important to address, but one that I thought was, so in that is that when we have, when we call someone and we say, you know what, my life is falling apart, it's really important that that person know that they can say the same things to us. And Amy, I hope you know you can always call me and tell me, because I call you often enough. But I think it's important that we find those people who we can hear it from as much as we can help. I know that when people call me and tell me that things are, you know, off the rails in their lives, even if everything is really off the rail in my life, I can be there. Mainly because I know it's not my burden to carry. It's not my load. It's not my job to fix it. It's my job to understand. And I was part of a support group once that our intro to new members was, we're glad you found us. We're sorry you had to, but we're really glad you did. And because only people looking for us were the people who needed us because they understood us. And the only way to understand us is that's the life they were living. We had this as a shared experience, and that was tough. So I know we've got people who are, you know, I know that people are asking, so how do we implement all of these things. And I know that you're going to talk about some of that, but I think strategies to gain these protective factors, because frankly, I don't know about you, but if you came to me and told me I needed to do one more thing, like, oh, you know, Laura, you have to do one more thing, I think I would just like pull the covers over my head.
And that's the flip here, is that's the thing is all day long, parents are focusing on the weaknesses, on the diagnosis, on the right? Like, and so it really is a paradigm shift to say instead, what one of these 5 things have you actually in your life done before? Where is your one strength in this list? And already, because we may be lacking, especially in a pandemic era, right? Like we may be lacking in social. It may have all threads to any social when we draw that picture may have fried, but where is it that you already are strong? Where is it that you're one place? Because that is our hope, right? Like that's the place. You guys have a lot to focus on. And I say you guys, meaning that I'm not living this right now, but parents have so much to focus on. But the hope lies in the strengths. You already have these strengths. It's not another, sure, we can grow. And I really say often, like the best gift we can give our kids is to say, I'm growing. I'm not a good enough parent today, and I'm doing my best to move forward and grow, right? So that's the best we have to give our kids. And so where is it that you do have these strengths? Some parents are saying, I look at that list and I don't see a strength in that. And I would say, you need more support in your life. And how can you call in professional support to help you build up these strengths?
I would also ask the people that you're closest with what your strengths are, because sometimes it's hard to see their own strengths, and especially when we are in the thick of things.
Absolutely.
And to have someone else that you love and admire and that you're close with be able to point those out is
wise. Yeah, that's a good idea. So that is a great place to start.
I think that frequently Amy's right. We don't see what we're good at ourselves. And it's interesting when people tell me what they think I'm good at. I often think that those are my biggest weaknesses. And they're like, no, you're really good at that. I'm thinking, you know, and I realize, well, the older I get, the more I realize that I am the hardest on myself, because I know what's in my brain of what I think I can do. And when I fall short of that, and other people will tell me that I've exceeded what their expectations were, and I'm not always sure I believe them, but I try.
I think that's where, you know, self-compassion comes in, the idea of self-compassion and treating ourselves the way that we would treat someone else. You know, what would you say to a friend? You know, I'm a really good friend. I'm able to be there with them and see the positive in them. It comes naturally to me. But when it comes to myself, that's a harder thing, right? Which I think is pretty common for everyone. So, you know, think about, how would you treat yourself, or how would you treat your best friend, or how would you treat someone that was really hurting? Would you kick them while they're down and be like, yeah, right, dude, that's terrible, you know, or yeah, you should have done this, this, and that? Or would you tell them the parts that they are doing good? You know, hey, everybody's alive today. Nobody went to the hospital today. Yay, there's no blood. Yay, nobody's been in the hospital for a year. I mean, you know, the reality for our families, that is something to celebrate and be able to recognize that. And I think it's important.
And I think one of the pieces, you know, when we were talking about this presentation, one of the pieces I said is, I can't give all this information and not have a place for parents to go afterwards, right? We can't go through this and not talk about like what do they come out of if they are their own piece. And I said at the beginning, like, I think this information is really hard. I think it brings up our own stuff, our own junk that we may have been right in front of us and we already realized, or we go, oh my word, what is my strength? And so having someone to process. And so we'll talk about that in a minute. And a provider commented that giving space to families has been somewhat helping, and that's one of the things we'll talk about in a minute. But looking at that one protective factor, what is your strength, and what is something you can provide? Because, you know, we talked about physical, we talked about emotional, spiritual, recreational, and educational tools. So what is there something you can put in place that's physical that helps bring up those protective factors, right? Is it a walk, 10 minutes that you get to yourself? That might be all some families can find. Is there a spiritual practice that you can put into your life? Is there recreational practices that you can do? I know that's like the most extreme on this list, but it's true that as a person who cares for families with extreme things, I've had to carve out some place where I say, this is mine, and this is a place where it keeps my own mental health intact. What are some educational tools? Sometimes just sparking those neurons in our brain of learning new things are good. And sometimes, Laura, the candy releases dopamine. Like, sugar is comforting. It's addictive, but it's comforting. And so, like, I'm not encouraging.
I had to find what I don't like too much. It's just
exactly. I was gonna say, I'm not encouraging it, but the fact is recognizing what our bodies, right? Like those things that do feed our soul. If you're becoming diabetic, obviously it's not feeding your soul, but but you get my point, right? Like, what feeds your soul, and where are you finding a place?
Well, I think being present. That. I mean, you know, what is it? Find 5 things you see, 4 things you feel, you know, whatever those exercises.
That's one of the tools, right?
Yeah, it's finding out what's going on right now, because I mean, right now there's a lot of stuff going on in my life, like right now today. But right now today, I have a camera in front of me, and so I'm very present. And I'm probably not that good at it all the time. I think that it's important for us to figure out where we are and stand there. And when you're standing in the middle of the hurricane, you know, to quote Hamilton, the eye of the hurricane, everything's spinning around you. Sometimes you just have to be glad you're standing in the middle and not in the storm, right? And sometimes you're in the storm and you're hoping it passes. Sometimes you know it's going to hit you a couple times. And I really do think when, you know, the comments that keep coming in about, you know, how do we teach people to do this? Sometimes the best thing I need is a hug. And in this day and age, it's not a real hug. It's an emotional hug. It's someone who can just say, wow, that's really hard. You know, you are doing something that is so difficult. I don't know how you're doing it. I'm really impressed. And sometimes that is so overwhelming to me in its comfort that I can do it all over again. If that makes sense, you know, like just having someone see me in my mess.
Recognizing that we've made it through it before. And that, you know, my husband will ask me often when we're going through a tough time, are you going to be okay? Are you going to make it? I'll be like, have I not made it yet? Like, I have no choice.
Because one of the 5 strengths is resilience, and you have a resilience, right? Like, that is a strength.
But I think one thing that helped me was to start recognizing what I can do for myself. And different seasons in life are going to look different, but I have a list on my phone. I like lists. I'm a to-do person. I like to see it. I like to check it off. I have a self-care list. I don't do every single thing on that list every single day, but I have a list, and it grows. And every time that I recognize that I am doing something for myself, I acknowledge it. And that tells me that I am important. And I cannot stress enough the importance of finding time to do something. And I know that that's going to look, believe me, you know, a house full of kids, I get it. That sometimes the only time that you have to yourself is from 12, midnight to 6 a.m. And so you decide what you're going to do during that time. And sometimes, I multitask my self-care list. I'll take a bath and I'll be reading at the same time or listening to music. I'll be making my phone calls to my friends, and they think it's hilarious, but that's how I do it. I'm like, I'm not going to just do one. I'm going to do all four at the same
in
time.
10 minutes.
Well, we're going to multitask self-care, people, but being able to recognize it, and you know, even if it's only a couple of things a day, and I know that it doesn't necessarily mean that you're going to feel better. There have been so many times in my life where I have literally felt like I've been drowning. And I can tell someone, well, you know, everyone's like, oh, you just need to take more time for yourself. Yeah. And here's my list of things that I do for myself, but it's still not enough. But one thing that I know, because we're wrapping up, one thing that has helped me significantly with the trauma is accelerated resolution therapy. And it was designed specifically for PTSD, and it started off with our veterans, but they found that it helps with a variety of traumatic experiences, and it has changed my life. You know, one session will make a huge difference. You know, I've spent a lot of time with professionals because of my children. Years and years of different types of therapies with my children, and even for myself, families, or whatever. And this accelerated resolution therapy has been life-changing for me. So,
and whether that helps or something else, I think the thing that Amy brought up that's the most important in my mind, and because I have, you know, done lots of trauma counseling, I think, first of all, being willing to recognize that handling someone else in your home with special needs can, in fact, be trauma. You sometimes feel like you're just a sucky parent if it impacts you. If I was a better parent, this wouldn't impact me. Well, no, that's not true. You're human. But even if accelerated resolution therapy isn't the right thing, there are so many options of treatments, and acknowledging that we are worthy and deserving of help on a professional level is huge. I think we feel less than when we ask sometimes for help, and that is not true. You can't, what do they say? You can't serve out of, you can't pour water out of an empty pitcher. And so just allowing ourselves, that is, I think, important, because allowing myself the first time to say I have a problem here was huge. I felt like I was a failure. And in fact, I walked out feeling like I was doing a better job than I had when I walked in.
Mm-hmm.
So.
And, Amy and Laura, I can't see the notes that I wrote today as I go through these slides, but I wrote for the conclusion to say what's next and strength and focusing on today, right? And that goes back to what you were saying, Laura, like being present. I would say that it's a little hard. Yeah, you're present and not attending to everything, but even this, it's hard to be present because we're still multitasking. We're still trying to check in with each other while giving a presentation and answering questions, either live or written. And so even this is not fully present, right? And being able to just be with people and connect with that. So I think that finding those strengths, those protective factors, and pondering that is important because it gives us strength to focus on today. And recognizing that we do have supports, we're not leaving you hanging. Please write down our emails so that we can peer-to-peer support you, that we can professionally support you. Also, Idaho Federation of Families has mini support groups during the month, foster, adoptive. We have a trauma parenting support group coming up next week. We have a transitioning from residential care. We have lots of different pieces, and I probably left out something, groups. And so please jump on our website, idahofederation.org, and sign up. The Parent
Network is going, we'll be.
And that's what I was going to say. And then the Parent Network will also have a list of resources. So no, we've started this conversation. Please don't think it's an end to what could be a triggering conversation. So thank you for being here.
Laura, did you get the questions? There was two questions, but they're not showing up on mine. I can't pop them.
So we answered them.
Okay. We answered them, but for those of you who are asking how you can get a hold of resources, we will post links to agents, organizations that license and handle different types of therapies. We're not promoting any of them specifically for you, but we are giving you the options of some of the things that have worked for us. So Michelle, I can't tell you how much I appreciate you facilitating this conversation today. And for everyone who has joined us, we've had a good group of questions, good group of people, and just, I guess, check the Federation site now and the Parent Network site in the days that are coming as we build those resource lists and publish them for you. So we're excited. Thanks
Yes.
everyone for joining us.
Having me.
Thank
Bye,
you.
ladies.